Thank you very much, Kimberly. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you everybody for joining this webinar. So let's just jump in. What I'm going to be talking about is basically a financial services perspective about scholarly publishing integrity. And what are we trying to do at Infolinx? Well, first, let me say Don and I, as Kimberly mentioned, both have long experience dealing in financial services, and a lot of it in risk management. And part of that is dealing with fraud. And we ended up dealing and trying to deal with problems in scholarly publishing because the question came to us, how similar are some of the challenges that face publishers, scholarly publishers, particularly dealing with fraud? How similar are they to what we've dealt with in consumer finance, think credit cards, over the last half a century? And Don and I both have spent, as Kimberly said, in my case, over 45 years dealing with these issues. And so we've seen what works and what doesn't work. And our mission, our goal here is to bring the best-in-class tools and strategies that we've seen work in financial services to scholarly publishing. So with that, let me just zoom the lens out and talk a moment about what we've seen success looks like structurally in organizations that manage consumer finance fraud. And it starts with data, a collection of data that comes from a variety of sources pulled together into a single source that is fit for the purpose of managing fraud. And that data are used in a variety of ways, one of which is for analytic purposes, to understand the problem, deconstruct the problem, and probe and figure out what is actually happening in the marketplace. The second is to use that data to build models, decision tools, which are over here, and have to work with that data to help make business decisions about problems that we have, in this case, around scholarly publishing fraud. And the third use of that data is to track the effectiveness of those policies and those tools by a third arm, which is a governance arm, a group that exists in the organization whose purpose is to study the data, make policy, and design the orientation for the tools that are going to be used in basically executing policy. Governance is something that we haven't seen developed in publishing at this point. And it was a surprise a little bit to Don and me as we got involved in this industry, because it's so deeply ingrained in financial services. Every lender has policy committees, risk policy committees, that try to make the trade-off between risk and reward. And in the case of scholarly publishing, that risk and reward looks like where do we set the dial between stopping papers that look like they might be problematic and letting them go, right? And we can turn the dial all the way down to basically have no publishing fraud by not publishing any papers. On the other hand, we can open the floodgates and publish everything, and we'll have a problem with lots of bad papers getting published. So it's a business policy issue that has to be made about where we set that dial between risk and reward, and the governance function really needs to be doing that. So I'm going to spend a lot of time today not talking about governance, although it's a function that needs to be built, but talking about data and how we're collecting and assembling data to build a series of decision tools. And I'm going to try to illustrate why those decision tools and how we're collecting that data might be different from what others are trying to do to solve the problems. So with that, let me talk about a few overarching principles that we bring to this that come out of the experience we have managing risk in consumer finance. One is we seek to focus on the actors perpetrating fraud, not just the symptoms of that fraud. So in the case of scholarly publishing, that means focusing on authors and scholars, not just on the symptoms of what those authors and scholars produce, which might be papers that include plagiarism, altered graphics, tortured language, and certain things that relate to the content of the papers. So we're going to focus on the actions of actors and the connections of those actors to predict something. Secondly, our approach focuses on looking at lots of data at the same time in a multivariate way. And that allows us to try to squeeze more, what we call information, really, squeeze more information out of a set of data, not looking at each factor one at a time. And for an example, when we look at multiple factors, we might come to a different conclusion if a author had one paper retracted and has been publishing for 20 years and has published 20 papers. That might mean something different than someone who's been publishing has published 8 papers, had one item retracted, and has been doing this now for 4 years. So those two factors together will make you look at the data differently, perhaps. And we'll try to consider more than just 2 factors at a time. We'll consider dozens of factors potentially at a time. Third basic principle that we're trying to bring to this is to leverage the dimension of time. And again, here's where looking at data based on where it occurred and when it occurred might lead us to a different conclusion. So, for example, a retracted paper that occurred 10 years ago and is 1 out of 40, like I just mentioned, might mean something different than a paper that was retracted 9 months ago for an author who has only been publishing for 5 years and has published 5 papers. So again, looking at time, when something happened, in the ordering, and how often it's happened, and even the velocity of things that have happened could mean something different depending upon when and how it occurred. So we want to leverage that. And we spend a lot of time trying to build tools that predict something. So in this case, we're trying to predict the likelihood that a paper will be retracted in the future at the time of publication. And the tools that we try to build to do that give us a real outcome, a probability that that's going to happen. And the tool, which is a score, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, rank orders. So the worst scoring group has a much higher chance of being retracted than the best scoring group. And the groups in between the best and the worst have a clear progression from one to the other. So rank orders an outcome. Those are all properties that we're trying to achieve, and these are principles that we're using in building what we're trying to do. The tools that we've seen now in the industry, Don and I, as we've now spent about 1.5 years working with scholarly publishers and trying to explore this problem, fall into 2 broad categories. There's a category that, and there's a lot of people working in this category, of paper content, where there are tools that look at plagiarism potentially in an article, looks for all altered graphics that have been turned on their side, that have been flipped, that use tortured language, that are irreproducible, that have odd data qualities. And there's a lot of tools that are being developed that are out there that do that and do that effectively. We are focused on the other dimension, on the other type of tools, which we call author networks. That is connecting lots of data over time that tells a story about an author historically and the connections among authors, institutions, papers, citations, and the like. There are others working in that realm, some of whom have built paper mill detectors. There was a recent story, an article in Nature about another group that has built a network solution that looks for problematic papers among a group of authors, that papers that have been retracted. And we're working in that realm, and we're doing it in a somewhat expanded way from the way others have done it. And I'm going to talk a lot about that because we're trying to develop those characteristics and properties of the models that I just laid out that are hard to really do, and I'm going to try and talk about why. But before I do that, what are the questions we're really trying to answer? by taking this approach. And so we're leveraging an author-centric network approach, this idea that we're going to build all kinds of connections among authors. And we're going to try to answer a few key questions. Well, what's the likelihood, having looked at his whole history about an author over time, that that author would produce a particular paper about a particular subject? Second question is, what's the likelihood that if an author is working with other authors, co-authors, that that group of authors would actually come together and work on a problem together that would produce a particular paper on a particular topic? Is that likely or unlikely, and why? And lastly, that paper that they produce together or as a single author is going to be legitimate. That's this future prediction. Those are the three questions that we're really focused on trying to answer in the models that we're trying to build. So underlying all this, as I talked about already a little bit, is building these very, very deep connections among authors, co-authors, the papers that the authors and co-authors produce, the citations of those papers, the references to those papers. Think about the history of where those authors have worked, the institutions they're affiliated with now, where they've been affiliated in the past, who's funded them, where they've spoken, conferences they've spoken at, fields of study they've done work in. There's a whole array of multidimensional information that we're connecting. Others have done this as well, and they've done it using tools you may have heard of, knowledge graphs, to try to connect all this data in a way that makes it easy to connect an author to a paper, to another author, to other papers they've done historically. The challenge is that the data that's been collected in this industry is continuing to accumulate and is not ever locked by time. That's something that is different from what we've experienced in financial services. In financial services, there are frequently archives made. Think about credit reporting agencies, for example, that take a snapshot of what the world looks like every month. They freeze the world and they save it. Lenders do that. They freeze the world and they save it. And that's really important when we're trying to reconstruct history to do predictive modeling. So for example, if the yellow dots in this graphic represent articles, the orange dots may represent authors, the blue dots something else. But if I want to take a look at this one article, this one published paper, I have to take the world back to what it looked like at the time that paper was produced, right? Because this whole network includes everything that's been done since that paper was produced, and we only can observe what happens at the time that paper was produced. Likewise, if I look at a different paper, we have to take the world back to a different time point. And every time we would do that, we would actually have to rebuild the knowledge graph to make the world look like what it looked like at that point in time. That's an incredibly difficult challenge. And frankly, we started the way many others in trying to solve the problem, the network problem, have tried to do it by starting with knowledge graphs as they are commonly used. And what we found is it doesn't let us really deal with that dimension of time. So we have spent a lot of time over the last year and a half trying to build a technology that allows us to rewind time to any point so we can see what the world looked like at a time that a publication was published, an article was published, or any other point in time. Why do we want to do that? Why is that really important? Well, because when we're trying to build a decision tool, a decision model, we want to take a look at what we know at the time we make the decision, what I'm calling here the decision point or the observation point. That's when we're going to look at what we know to try to make a prediction about what's going to happen over a performance period. So in this case, we're trying to make a prediction about a journal article at the time it's published, we can look at things that we know items that we know at the time it was published. We can look at other papers that author has published previously. We can look at the co-authors that might be on that paper. We can look at the citations on that paper. We can look at references on previous papers, but we can't look at references on that paper because they haven't occurred yet. Those will happen in the future. Excuse me. We can look at comments on previous work, but not on comments on this work. So we have to only look at information we know at that time. We can, in a performance period, evaluate anything that can be measured. So here we're trying to measure whether a paper was retracted, and we're going to say that a retracted paper is a bad outcome. A paper that was not retracted is a good outcome. We could use this technology or this approach to really predict anything. And so, for an example, for those who may be academics on this call, let's say we were trying to predict, let's say an academic who is in his third year of teaching. What's the likelihood they'll receive tenure? But we could look at this observation point, year 3 when they're teaching. We could look at history about that academic. What have they published? Feedback, comments on their teaching ability, where have they spoken, various things like that. And we could look out over the next several years and say, okay, did they get tenure or not? And build a model that would predict that outcome. In this case, we're trying to do that for scholarly papers. Unfortunately, the data we have to look at scholarly papers is classified by calendar year or by month published. So when we look at an author, we see a history of papers that are published over time. A second author publishes papers over time. But if we want to observe the paper, this one I'm pointing to, that author 1 did in 2022, we have to turn the world back and eliminate the paper published after. We can't consider that. We can't consider any of the co-authors, maybe author 2, author 3, and their works that occurred after that time point. But we can consider everything that happened previously. So we have to take that data that's aligned by calendar period and revert it back to a time period or time orientation that aligns all of these papers at the time they were published. Or if we want to be actionable, let's just say a day before they're published, which would look just like the day they're published, really, when we can observe them and make a decision about them based on the likelihood that they will be retracted in some period after. That's a very, very difficult thing to do with the data as it's constructed, because the data in the scholarly world, and there's a lot of it, which is really a good thing, and a lot of it is publicly available, but it's not designed for this purpose. It's designed to be a support for researchers looking for papers that are aligned with the research topic at hand. So we spent a lot of time trying to take all of that data, and we're still doing it, and we think at this point, having worked at it for about 1.5 years, we think we're a few weeks to a couple of months away from basically having achieved that. But to take the world and to be able to turn it back to any point in time to create observation points for events. An event might be when it was published. It might be when a paper is submitted. An event might be when a grantor, a research funder might be making a decision about funding a research effort. So we have to turn the world back to that point in time, and not just look back at cutting off papers, but all of the associated items that relate to that paper. So after a paper is published, in this case here, I'm going to point to this one, we have references that are made to that paper that occur after the time it's published, comments that are made about that paper after the time it's published. We can't consider any of that because we didn't know it at the time it was published. Likewise, we can't consider this paper that was published after the one we care about was published. And for papers that we can look at that have references and comments that relate to it we can only consider those that occur up to the point of our observation. We cannot consider anything that occurs out here to the right because it hasn't occurred yet. And likewise, back here, we can only consider what's occurred here. We have to truncate what's occurred there, so we end up with a world that looks truncated. This is a big effort, but it's essential for doing the types of decision tools that we're trying to do that predict a future outcome, rank order that outcome, create a metric that lets us decision on that outcome, the likelihood of that outcome, and is multivariate in nature. So let me, so now having laid out that problem, which we are really trying to address, and affects anyone trying to build decision tools that have the properties that we're trying to bring to the market. Let me talk about what we have succeeded in doing, applying that approach. And we've built a model. We built several models, actually, but I'm going to share one with you that we built that predicts. We looked at, and again, we haven't finished being able to realign all that data. So we did have a sample that was time aligned at a point in time about 10 months prior to the performance point. So we built a model that said at the time of publication or a day before publication, the model looks at 6 characteristics simultaneously at our observation point and produces a score that rank orders the likelihood a paper will be retracted over 10 months. And that was the modeling definition. It doesn't mean that you can only apply it for 10 months after. In fact, it will predict the likelihood that a paper will be retracted out into the future indefinitely. But this model, it uses 6 characteristics, separates the world into a bad group. And here we've broken the score, this is the score range, into the worst 20%, the next worst 20%, the next worst 20%, all the way down to the best 20%. So we created 5 groups broken by score into 20% breaks. And this is terrific, a terrific result. We were able to identify 60 times more bad publications, 60 times the number of publications or the rate of publications that are likely to be retracted into the future in the worst 20% than in the best 20%. Oops, I'm sorry. That is a huge lift. And it also has the property we're trying to achieve, which is it rank orders. Our worst group is worse than our next worst group, which is next than our next worst group, and so on. And this best group, best 20%, is a very low retraction rate. And the height of these bars actually measures the retraction rate. So this prediction not just predicts something that's going to happen, but how likely it's going to happen in the future. So what can we do with a tool like that? Well, we can start making decisions. The governance function, which we talked about, the group of the team that sets policy can now use this tool to decide what we're going to evaluate deeper and what we're not. So here's a chart that analysts would look at to evaluate a predictive score like what we're trying to build. And effectively what this is doing is it's showing you how well it separates bads. And this is the cumulative distributions of bads basically by the score along the x-axis. By score, how quickly does going from the worst score up do we accumulate bads compared to accumulating goods? And since the world is mostly, and publications are mostly filled with good articles, right, this line, the good line, pretty much moves almost like a straight line up as the population increases. But the bad curve really accumulates bads in the worst scoring ranges and doesn't accumulate many bads up here. So if we were a publisher, for example, and we wanted to use this score at the point where it really does its best job of separating goods from bads, and this is the point that I've highlighted here, and as a metric that we will use to look at scores called KS. It won't be on the exam, you don't need to know it, but it's basically the difference between the percentage of bads accumulated or captured at a score at a point against subtracted, we subtract the number of goods, percent of goods from there, and we end up with this difference. So at this score of 4, we have accumulated about 80% of our bads, but only had to look at 25% of our goods. So if a publisher wanted to use this tool, they could say, I'm going to draw a line right here, a cutoff, if you will, and I'm only going to evaluate publications, journal articles to be published that score 4 or worse. That would now eliminate basically 3/4 of the articles that don't have to be reviewed. It's also where additional tools might come into play. So a publisher who's developed a series of content tools, might now say, okay, in this group that's here, or maybe even a little bit more, I might widen that if I were trying to set policy a little bit to say, now if I look at plagiarism tools, tortured language tools, and the like, can I now refine this estimate to say, can I squeeze more bads over here to the left and more goods to the right and not have to evaluate quite as many with people, right? Which is our scarcest resource, our reviewers, to really go and dig into the publication itself. So this is pretty powerful. Now, flip side, and this may be almost an easier way to think about it. If we look on this other tail here, we could, as a publisher, draw a line here and say, if I really don't want to spend any resources on this tail, I would basically impact nobody, right? I could not look at 40% of the papers, which is where my arrow is, and affect almost no bads in these high scoring ranges. So I can say, okay, I draw a line here. Don't even bother looking at this group. Down here, I want to dig into more deeply, and it's a way of allocating our resources so that we can, basically spend less time and money evaluating papers that don't need to be evaluated, and more time and resources on those that do need it. This is a very powerful tool, and we're very pleased with these results. What are we working on going forward? Well, we're really trying to focus on leveraging these author networks to create what we're calling the author DNA. And so the model I just showed you is built using more traditional modeling approaches that are used in financial services, very effective. They've been around for a long time, and they work. What we're trying to do, and we haven't finished doing this, so we're in the midst of research around this, is actually to create what we're calling author DNA. That is essentially building out this whole time series of author behavior, going back as long as we can go back, that says, here's where this author studied, here's what the author has researched, here's what the author has published, who they published with, what papers they've cited, what papers have been retracted, not retracted, have had comments about them that are problematic or strongly favorable, co-authors' behaviors, references to those publications, where they have spoken, and we're trying to bring in lots of new data. We have Semantic Scholar currently in our database. We have a variety of other sources in our database, but we're also looking now, and we've captured some information from Crossdraft. We're trying to incorporate ORCID, which is obviously hosting this webinar, which has valuable information about author histories that we want to capture, their backgrounds, some verified, some not verified. We want to try to capture other paper data, and using all of this, some of it being contradictory, some of it being supportive, we are going to try to deal with basically leveraging this DNA to assess whether an author, to answer our fundamental questions. Did an author looking at this history produce a given paper? Do a combination of authors together come from the same family? And looking out over a performance window in the future, is the paper legitimate or likely to be retracted? So we are really trying to squeeze a lot of data together to make predictive assessments about a particular publication, a particular submission, if we can move the decision point earlier, or about any other decision we need to make in the life of a research paper. Might go back as far as the funding of that research effort. The other issue that we hope to deal with by pulling all of this data together, and it's a big one that has not been solved really fully, and we hope to make some headway there, is the disambiguation problem. Names that look the same, that are the same, but might be referred to different authors who have done different work, and sometimes are lumped together because we can't distinguish which author actually relates to which piece of work. And our attempt to do that is going to be to use fuzzy logic by capturing different pieces of information about those authors that sound the same, and see if we can build a tool that helps us identify which particular authors relate to particular histories, and try to make some headway in dealing with disambiguation. The other thing we're focusing on is trying to move the decision points earlier. So right now, we are situated, as are many, at the point of publication. That's where the public data are available. And not just publications, we're really looking at open access publications where they're publicly available, and we can look at those. Unfortunately, it's way down the pipeline where the volumes are lower and our ability to impact fraud is late in the game, and maybe costlier. We are trying to work with publishers and others in the industry to move this decision point earlier, where we get greater volume, greater leverage at lower cost. Paper submissions, which would come in before editors spend a lot of time with it, certainly before peer reviewers dig into assessing the paper. And this is actually a big issue. We think peer reviewers are trained in doing a particular and they're very highly trained in a very specialized research area. The idea that they would spend time looking for fraud is a misuse of that resource. It's a very, very scarce and precious resource, and we should be feeding them filtered articles that have been screened for problems. So by pushing these tools earlier, paper submission, and really beyond that, before research is funded, we can really reduce what flows downstream to where it is more costly to deal with and more intrusive to deal with. Likewise, we think research institutions will be interested in using tools like this to assess the quality of research efforts going on and the actors in their institutions. Where should funding go? Where should oversight be maybe placed? And back ultimately to the grantors. Where should funding be placed? Again, these are probabilistic outcomes. It doesn't mean that every author that is found to raise a flag should be stopped, but it may suggest that some may need to be looked at a little bit more with a little bit more scrutiny. So we're looking to take these tools and push them earlier in the process, and we're looking to work with those who want to work with us, publishers, others in the industry who want to make that happen. So we're really eager to work with others to bring, to try and make progress against this problem. So what are we working on, and where do we think the puck is going in this industry? Well, we're obviously trying, as I've said repeatedly, to enhance our data to make it fit for the purpose that we are trying to apply. Fit for trying to build decision tools and governance analytics that allow publishers and others in the industry to deal with scholarly publishing fraud. Right, so we're trying to really enhance that database to be able to turn the time back to any point where we need to make a decision. Secondly, we're working with publishers and other institutions to try to capture more data and actually to help us understand the industry. As I said at the very beginning, and Kimberly, as she introduced us, we're really new to scholarly publishing. We're actually new to research, scholarly research. We spent our careers in financial services, so we kind of know the tools and the methodologies to address fraud. We would love to work with those who are applying. We need to apply those tools into this domain, and we'd love to find partners. We are doing that actually. We are talking with quite a few publishers currently, and looking to work with other institutions to try to make that happen. We are working hurriedly to take that data and to build out this author DNA and the decision tools that really leverage off of that. This is all new work, right? There was an approach that we are pioneering that we think really will be very exciting, and we think it will work. The early results are very promising, that allow us to look much like a geneticist would look at DNA to try to assess whether authors and scholars come from the same family, we should work together, whether things that we're seeing are consistent with that DNA in terms of what a particular participant in the scholarly environment is really producing. And lastly, we are really trying to encourage, and again, it's something where we think will eventually evolve. We watched it happen in financial services. We watched it be resisted and ultimately happen, which is the sharing of data across the industry. That dealing with fraud is an industry problem, and what I didn't really spend a lot of time on is the nature of fraud in this discussion. But fraud moves quickly from one participant to another, and just because one publisher thinks they have an insight into how it's happening today, doesn't protect them in the future, because it'll then pop up somewhere else. And the industry needs to share data. We think that will evolve. And we actually think it will evolve differently here than it did in financial services, because technology is different than when it evolved in financial services. So we think it'll evolve in a shared model where data will be owned and reside with its data owner, but will be shared bilaterally using agreements as it makes sense for all participants to share that data. We think it'll ultimately be shared more broadly than it will start, but we are working to encourage and accelerate that happening in any way that we can. I say that because the sharing of data and the networking model is the most robust and most defensive in terms of managing fraud. So while, and I talked earlier about the content tools that are being developed, while they're very exciting and they help, they're the least stable in the environment, because tools that look at the content are more easy to circumvent. And those who are out to perpetrate fraud spend their time figuring out how to circumvent tools. So, for example, tortured language, right, which may be an important component in content tools. Once it's understood in the community out to perpetrate fraud rings and paper mills, the tortured language that's being picked up will change. And so the models may not pick it up as well. And that'll move fast, and they'll change quickly. And I can give you lots of examples from financial services where items and elements of content or immediate behavior were circumvented and fraud moved. The networking models and the author DNA is very, very hard to replicate, very, very hard to defraud, because it's really hard to recreate history in a way that defrauds it. So those are the things we're working on. It's where the puck is going. We're very excited to be working in this industry. We think that there's a lot to be done, and a lot of improvements can be made. And with that, I'm happy, and Don and I are both happy to answer any questions, and I'll turn it back to Kimberly. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Don, for such a wonderful presentation. We've got some questions coming in. I'm going to give our audience a minute or two to collect their thoughts and submit some more questions. I do want to share with everyone, we've got some great upcoming events next week on Wednesday, we'll actually be hosting NASA for a webinar. They're going to come and talk to us about their Transformed Open Science initiative and its ORCID integration. And then the Wednesday after that, we will be our data privacy officer, Ellen Patterson, will be talking to us again about research integrity. So hope to see you all at these events coming up. It looks like our first question here is, how do you distinguish between people with the same name, knowing anyone can register for an ORCID? Would you support any kind of identity verification to get an ORCID?
Don, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, happy to. As Alan alluded to when we started talking about the author solution, is that a name for identifying an individual is only one piece of data that we would look at. Actually, let me answer the second piece of that first about identity verification. I think so. I don't see why we shouldn't, and I don't see why an author shouldn't be willing to, in the interest of sort of forwarding the discipline or the science, be willing to kind of participate in a data gathering exercise that helps kind of, they say, take care of bad actors. But the issue with being able to disambiguate is really around the problem of what do you know in terms of what this person has potentially done historically, and can you use that to uniquely identify and discriminate them? And so to the extent that you have names that look similar, is that you can trace out what those similarities are and known links to various authors and who those people, what they've done historically, much like we're talking about the DNA stream, and be able to use that to help do this disambiguation. So there's dealing with the fraud problem and dealing with disambiguation. Disambiguation is kind of a, if you thought about unintentional fraud and what happens with being unable to identify people uniquely, is that it's kind of a variation on a fraud problem, because there are people that are genuinely trying to be deceitful about who they are, and then there's just other people that are hard to identify. So it's kind of part and parcel of the same problem, and we believe that in terms of building out these profiles or DNA strings, is that will be the key to being able to answer a lot of these related issues.
Thanks, Don. Another question that we received at registration was curious. Have you been able to find sufficient data sources to drive your approach? And what is the most important data that you haven't yet been able to find?
Don, another question for you.
Yeah, sure. Actually, as Alan alluded to, there's almost an embarrassing riches of data, almost too much data out there. And the problem is not so much with getting data, it's getting it in a form that Alan mentioned is fit for purpose. Is that all of the data that is currently aggregated is pretty much dedicated to doing what I'll call bibliographic analysis. Is that I want to be able to do research and find out who's published in this area before, what have they published, and what are the influential publications that I need to make sure I understand and be able to talk about and discuss and so on. So the idea of having something that is constantly accumulating and helping you best understand that is absolutely perfectly fit for purpose for that types of analytics. It is not fit for purpose for the types of analytics that we need to do, which is to be able to freeze things at a point in time and say, what did we know prior to these outcomes that we're trying to stop or identify, and can we use that information? What's the information value embedded in all that data that accumulated up to the point that the artifact appeared, the paper appeared, that we could potentially use to address the future likelihood that that paper is going to be retracted or in some way called into question. So that problem is very different from bibliographic analytics, and taking this wealth of data that is designed for bibliographic analytics and turning it into something that is more useful, more fit for purpose for addressing fraud is a huge, huge endeavor. We started out in Semantic Scholar. We have leveraged the metadata that they have provided. We are now in the midst of incorporating Crossref. We find that the metadata that from both of those sources is very informative. The data that we are most anxious to get our hands on and that we'd like to see kind of a richer source of and want to more fully exploit is around affiliations and associations. Like get a richer, more author-centric view of where did this person sort of start their career and how has that career evolved. So we're working on putting that piece together, but we found incredible information value in just the traditional metadata that we've been able to extract from sources like Semantic Scholar. That model you saw was based on metadata from that single source.
Right. So just to add to that a little bit, I mean, some of the data we are having the wings once we were able to realign to where we talked about the citation data that we and the reference data. We ultimately like to get comment data. Now, one type of data that we'd actually like to bring in that we have not been able to do yet is pre-publication data, and that is like submissions. And so that would require us to work with publishers who have that, that they hold that data, and they need to work with us to be able to build any kind of submission tools. So while we have a richness of data in the published domain, we don't have that yet as we move further back in time to submissions or grantors, funding grantors and the like.
Thanks, Alan and Don. Is there a way, if there's any, submission, those who work for submission sites or grant funders on the line, is there a way for them to reach out to you and form a connection?
Absolutely. If you, are emails available through this webinar?
I can share them if you'd like.
Yes, so please do.
Absolutely,
And actually,
please do.
anyone who wants to, but absolutely, 100%, we would not just encourage it, we would love to talk to organizations that want to work with us, that have access, publishers that have access to submission data and actually want to build this out. And we think that's the way to go. We think there's a lot of value in doing that. And yes, we're very eager to have those conversations.
Great. Well, I will include your contact information in the follow-up emails that go out after the webinar. Our next question, kind of from the ORCID side, is ORCID deals in positive signals around identity and integrity. Do you see any downsides to scrutinizing author DNA and the potential impact on early career researchers or those from the global South who may not have accumulated as much DNA as an established academic?
Well,
Go ahead, Alan. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll turn it over to you in a second. That is actually the value. So certainly, individuals have long history and detailed history will be easier to resolve where they belong in that score, in the score range, than someone who is, has very little history and is brand new and doesn't have a lot of data. But the notion of multivariate, the multivariate approach we're taking makes that less likely to happen because we're looking at all the information that's available about that individual simultaneously, which lets us say, okay, among populations or groups that have less history and a thinner piece of DNA, a thinner strand, we can squeeze out the information that's there. Maybe not as well as one that's longer, but we can do as good a job as can be done with that particular information. If we had only one size and one element, we wouldn't be able to do that. That's why we look at all the data at the same time to maximize the decisions, the value in that information. Don, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. No, yeah, so that problem pops up in all kinds of forms, and coming from the financial services space is that there's a whole segment of the population that runs into a similar sort of problem with financial services too, is that you have people that are new to banking, new to credit, and the ability to be able to discriminate and make correct decisions or favorable decisions around people that are new in an environment are always a challenge. And that's where the importance of the connected data, and as Alan alluded to, the sort of the richer sorts of information that comes from being able to take that person and build out that string with things that will be present in established authors that were there when they were unestablished as well. And now you can draw out the parallel between new authors or authors that are trying to become established, academics that are trying to become established, and whether they look the same or does it look like he's evolving in a similar sort of pattern? And are they connected to people in a way that would make sense given where it is that they're studying, where the things that they've been studying and so on. So it's a more challenging task, but there's definitely data here that, given our experience in other fields, that can be brought to bear.
Thanks. And then this is kind of similar as we talk about, you know, the differences and similarities between scholarly data and financial service data. What's the most surprising thing that you've learned as you've delved into the scholarly data versus financial services data?
Well, one was the most surprising. It was the fact that the data are just not ever. Well, it's a couple of things. One, the data are organized the way it's organized. That it's taken a lot more effort than we ever imagined to organize it in a way that lets us make the decisions. Second thing, and it's not actually around the scholarly data, at least to me, it is a surprise. Was, I mean, when Don and I first started talking to publishers, the notion of governance was something that we took for granted. So in financial services, lending is all about risk, right? And risk management. It's so deeply ingrained that there are institutions throughout, lenders and banks, that deal with the setting policy around risk and reward all the time at the direct board of directors level, in every business unit, all the way through an organization. There are governance risk management committees that make those decisions. They don't exist in publishing. And it's something that, in order to develop and deal with fraud on a long-term basis, they're going to have to develop. And so that was a surprise. Getting to the specifics of the data, I mean, Don, do you want to talk to specific attributes of
Yeah, I guess one of the things that initially it was a bit of a surprise, but then in hindsight it made sense, was that I'll call it, the data was kind of messy in the sense of being not being disambiguated much at all. And as we worked with it more, it kind of became apparent to us that, well, if you're doing bibliographic research, is that you'd rather cast that net wide and say, look, I'm not going to, as a provider of this data, I'm not going to make decisions for you in terms of what may or may not be important relative to the thing that you're trying to get information on. So there might be a lot of dead ends that you'll meet in terms of trying to sort out what we think are potential articles that may or may not have been published by one of these authors or co-authors, but we're going to give them to you anyway. And so some of the challenges around that were like, oh my God, it's like, this could have been tidied up a lot more, but we came to understand like why it wasn't. And so that part of that then became the task of how do you get from that to something that, again, the notion of fit for purpose is that we have a very different orientation to how we want to use that data, and having that net cast so widely actually creates problems for us trying to solve our problem, as opposed to what that other purpose was for that data.
One other thing that I wasn't surprised us, but pleased us, and not to spend too much time on this point, is that using, as Don said, that model we shared is really built only on metadata at the time of publication, and doesn't incorporate a lot of other data that we are in the midst of trying to bring into our database. At how powerful these models are at separating basically fraud from non-fraud, retracted articles from non-retracted articles, which says to us, and encouragingly so, that the patterns that occur amongst all this data are fairly profound between groups that perpetrate fraud and groups that don't, and that the problem, while it's a difficult problem, is we've had success with relatively little of the data that we want to actually incorporate. So that's a very pleasing outcome, and I won't say surprised, but I guess a little surprised.
Well, thank you for the very detailed answers. Here's our last question, and I think it kind of relates to something we talked about earlier. getting publishers to share confidential submission data right now may be challenging given the class action lawsuit alleging industry collusion. How did you navigate similar challenges in the financial industry?
Well, that's sort of a legal question, and I know they did. They third parties, the credit bureaus, all get fed information from all the parties, and so I'm not qualified to speak on that. I will say they initially started very hesitantly, and in time, organizations didn't want to share information because they thought it was a competitive benefit, competitive advantage. Over time, they realized it was less that they all benefited from sharing it, and so over time, almost every lending institution submits their data about payments and non-payments and how much credit is provided to credit reporting agencies. And fraud is completely shared because it's an industry problem that nobody wins. And so that is shared in very detailed ways across the industry and all those models that work. When you use your credit card at the point of sale, all that data is being considered. In fact, it's not unlike the type of thing we talked about, the DNA of your behavior, your historic behavior, being compared with the behavior of those out to commit fraud. Right? Those patterns are analyzed instantaneously at the point of sale to make decisions about fraud. So
I guess the only thing I would add,
legal issues I can't really speak to. Don.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to Alan's question is that a lot of what happened with the credit bureaus was that they were sort of identified as a trusted source, and to the extent that you've got a trusted source, perhaps even yourselves, where you can create a hashed ID that belongs to individuals that is unique and cannot be replicated, but exists in the background and is only identifiable to people on your side of the wall, is that creates an opportunity then for information to be potentially shared and distributed anonymously based upon a hashed ID that in terms of providing it to you as here's an author that has submitted a work, and that you could potentially return information or provide shared information that would be usable for research purposes, only knowing what that hashed ID was. But there has to be somebody in the background that, to Alan's point, has been legally identified, is legally on the hook to protect that data and make sure that only the anonymized ability to link it and connect it is what ever gets revealed to any party that's interested.
Well, great. Thank you both. I think what you've just commented on really echoes the situation with ORCID and fair data principles in academia. Stakeholders shouldn't be competing on data that has a net community benefit. The competition should be downstream of that. So we are at the end of our time. I really want to thank both Alan and Don for joining us today and giving us a lot to think about, and also welcome you to the scholarly community. We're happy to have you and your innovative approaches. I also want to thank all of our audience for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future event. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Kimberly.
We're happy to be here. Yeah. Thanks.